Hello and welcome back to the Open Wheel Show. My name's David, and in this episode, we're going to be talking about the next 4 teams in our F1 2020 preview, introduction to the cast of characters, that kind of thing. We're going to cover McLaren, Renault, Tauri, which is a new name but an old team, and Racing Point. We'll kick things off by talking about McLaren. Last year in 2019, they finished 4th in the Constructors' Championship, and they're one of the most recognizable names on the grid. They were founded in 1963 by New Zealand racing driver Bruce McLaren and has become one of the most recognizable names in the world. They have production cars, hypercars, the new McLaren Senna, the McLaren F1. These are some of their more recognizable production vehicles. But they are primarily a racing team in Formula One. As a racing team, they are actually one of the most successful teams in F1 history, but their performances in recent years have been pretty abysmal. It's gotten better. They definitely took a strong step forward last year, but prior to that, particularly in the Fernando Alonso days, not so great. Their team principal these days is a guy by the name of Andreas Seidel. He formerly worked in F1 for BMW back in the 2000s. He joined McLaren just last year, was his first year as team principal at McLaren. Prior to that, he ran Porsche's LMP1 team. The real power at McLaren, though, has to be considered to be Zak Brown. He's the CEO of McLaren. He's sort of rose up through the ranks there over the last several seasons and is, by all accounts, a really able manager and is pointing the racing team in the right direction these days. In terms of driver lineup, they have 2 drivers. One of them is leaving at the end of the season already. We know this for a fact because that is Carlos Sainz Jr. He has been signed by Ferrari to replace Sebastian Vettel starting in 2021. He is the son of Carlos Sainz Sr., obviously, and Sainz Sr. is something of a rally legend. He's actually still racing. He just competed in the Dakar Rally last year at a pretty ripe old age. Sainz Jr. in Formula One has had a bit of a journeyman career. He came up through the Red Bull Junior program. He raced for Toro Rosso alongside Max Verstappen, but then he was kind of shoehorned out because of all the other talent sort of in the pipeline there. He drove for Renault and then moved to McLaren, and obviously will be moving to Ferrari. So he's kind of been up and down the grid in a variety of circumstances. That being said, he is a solid, dependable driver. I think personally that he's a little bit underrated by the grid, although more and more people are coming to that conclusion, so I guess you can't really call him underrated anymore. But he's definitely quick, he's reliable, he's consistent, and he should be a really great addition to Ferrari. If Charles Leclerc doesn't work out for whatever reason, if, being a fashion model is too much for Leclerc, I think you could do way worse than having Sainz on the team. It is a little bit of a shame, though, because Sainz Jr. had really great chemistry off the track with the other McLaren driver last year, which is Lando Norris. Lando Norris is a British driver. Some consider him to be a paid driver. He certainly comes from like a privileged sort of background, but he's got an amazing junior record. He's won in karting, in Formula Renault, in Formula 3. He came second in Formula 2 to George Russell in 2018 before making the jump to Formula 1. So he's very clearly, he's a quick driver, he's talented, and he deserves his spot in McLaren. He's also a bit of like a meme lord, if we're perfectly honest. Like he clearly is on Reddit. He live streams on Twitch even before the pandemic made all the Formula One drivers at least consider streaming. So he's been around. I remember watching him on iRacing streams back in 2018, in between Formula 2 races. He would hop on there and do some iRacing with his friends. Really great personality, and I'm actually, as sad as I am about Sainz moving on because Sainz and Norris had really great chemistry together, I can't even imagine the memes and the hilarity that's going to ensue next year in 2021 when Daniel Ricciardo joins the team, and that's who we're going to transition into talking about next. That's Renault. Renault is what we call a works team, which basically means they develop their own chassis and engine, the whole package. So similar to Mercedes and Ferrari, at least in theory. Unfortunately, they have not replicated the success that they had in the mid-2000s since returning to the sport. Renault as a team first appeared in Formula One in 1977, but kind of came and went, and only in the year 2000 did it enter its sort of current incarnation after purchasing Benetton back then. In 2011, they began their transformation into Lotus F1, which lasted only for about 5 years before transitioning back into just plain old Renault. So technically, the current incarnation of the Renault F1 team begins in 2016. In the 3 years, 2016, 2017, 2018, they made pretty consistent progress forward. They started at the back of the grid and they moved their way up. In 2018, they finished 4th in the Constructors' Championship. But then last year, they took a bit of a step back. They finished 5th, ultimately, by the end of the year last year, but they started the season off just looking abysmal. They were nowhere, and that was really unfortunate because they had just signed a new star driver in the form of Daniel Ricciardo. Before we talk about him, though, I do want to mention their team principal, who is Cyril Abiteboul. He's the one team principal, I think, on the grid that's really on the hot seat this year. You could consider maybe Gunther Steiner over at Haas to be on the hot seat, but we'll discuss that in the next episode. Cyril, though, I feel like if he is, unless Renault achieves some podiums this year, somewhat miraculously, given their history and their progression, unless that happens, unless there is a minor miracle, I think Cyril's going to be out by the end of the year. So it's something to keep an eye on over the course of the 2020 season. But that's enough about him. Let's finally talk about Daniel Ricciardo. He's one of the most lovable personalities on the grid, I think. Him alongside Norris, like I said, is going to be just hilarious. He had great chemistry at Red Bull off the track with Max Verstappen, but on the track, it was sort of a different story. Ricciardo's history is not necessarily complicated. It's pretty straightforward, actually. He was a Red Bull junior. He came up through the ranks. He started in Toro Rosso, then moved to Red Bull. He raced one season alongside Sebastian Vettel before Vettel departed to Ferrari, and then he raced alongside Danny Kvyat and then Max Verstappen. It's a bit unfortunate because he was sort of the senior member of the Red Bull team, all things considered on paper, but the boot of destiny that is Max Verstappen just crushing hopes and dreams left and right made it quickly apparent over the first couple of years there that Max was sort of the future. There was a lot of sort of political infighting behind the scenes at Red Bull, and ultimately all these factors seemed to combine to make Ricciardo look for a drive somewhere else. Now, in somewhat of a funny turn of events, he had two major suitors back in 2018 when he was considering leaving Red Bull. That was McLaren and Renault. He went with Renault because at the time Renault was on the upswing and McLaren was on the down. However, here we are just one season later and he has already committed to moving to McLaren in 2021. My fear is that he turns into sort of an Alonso-esque figure without the World Championships. By that I mean, I fear that he will end up spending his career chasing a good seat and not really setting down roots in the right places and never being able to drive a championship-winning car. That's more or less what happened to Fernando Alonso after his back-to-back World Championships at Renault in 2005-2006. Pairing alongside Ricciardo, though, this year at Renault is Esteban Ocon, who is a Formula One driver. He did not drive last year in 2019 because he lost his seat at Racing Point when Racing Point used to be Force India. Esteban Ocon was driving there alongside Sergio Perez. We'll talk more about Racing Point in just a minute. Ocon, though, the notable things about him are that he is a Mercedes junior driver. He's part of that program. Somewhat hilariously, none of the Mercedes young drivers have actually ended up in a Mercedes drive yet, but there were reports that Ocon is essentially at the top of the list right now in terms of Mercedes drivers that are floating around that haven't had a crack at the big team yet and will replace either Lewis Hamilton or Valtteri Bottas, depending on who leaves first. So in the past, like I said, he drove for Force India for a couple of years alongside Sergio Perez. And if I'm honest, I mean, he seemed to generate enough buzz to warrant continue being on sort of the Mercedes, not payroll, but in the Mercedes orbit. To me, though, I think that he was pretty inconsistent. And so this year and next year at Renault, because he is on a 2-year deal, seem to be like kind of make or break years for Ocon. If he's able to prove that he is a little bit more mature in his driving style and can stay out of incidents and can be consistent, then I think he will remain at the top of Mercedes' list of candidate drivers to replace Hamilton or Bottas. But if he can't, well, that's probably going to be it for him. I'm sure there's going to be a Formula E drive at some point in Ocon's future. He's somebody that I think a lot of people consider to be championship material, but honestly, I just kind of don't see it. All right, so moving on, we're going to talk next about Scuderia AlphaTauri. Technically the newest name on the grid, but definitely not the newest team on the grid. They are the team formerly known as Scuderia Toro Rosso being Italian for Red Bull. That should, if you aren't already familiar, that should lead you to the conclusion that this is a Red Bull team. This is in fact Red Bull's B team. Now, what B team means historically is junior team, and that's certainly the way that they have been treating it, all the way up through last year. Toro Rosso basically is the proving ground for Red Bull Junior Academy candidates in Formula One. Recent PR things have basically indicated that with the switch from Toro Rosso to AlphaTauri as their branding, they are also trying to kind of remake their image into that of a sister team to Red Bull rather than like a junior team to Red Bull. They've got two really great drivers. They've got a team principal there, Franz Tost. I never know how to say it, if I'm perfectly honest. But really the team is run and managed in terms of its drivers and personnel by Helmut Marko, who is, as his name sounds, basically the evil genius villain of Formula One. He runs the Red Bull Junior program, and he is the reason why Max Verstappen was, somewhat rightfully so. I mean, you can't fault him for evaluating talent, but he was the reason why Max Verstappen was shoehorned into that Red Bull seat as soon as humanly possible, and he continues to be a huge influence within the Red Bull orbit. Their driver lineup remains unchanged from the end of last year, and that is Pierre Gasly and Danny Kvyat. If you listen to the first episode in this small series introducing the F1 2020 grid, you will be familiar with some part of this. Basically, Alexander Albon started off at Toro Rosso last year, but mid-season swapped seats with Pierre Gasly up at the main Red Bull team. Upon returning to Toro Rosso, Pierre Gasly actually performed really, really well again and even managed to secure a podium, as did Danny Kvyat at a different race. So somewhat remarkably, the junior Red Bull team had 2 podiums, which is 2 more podiums than the second Red Bull seat had all year long. If I'm perfectly honest, I see Pierre Gasly as a perfect candidate for Renault in the future. He's a Frenchman, and that always plays well with like sort of the home crowd. He's definitely a capable driver. I don't see him being a team leader. I don't see him being really even a championship contender given his performance at Red Bull. All that being said, though, he is a perfectly competent driver. He has shown flashes of brilliance here and there, and I think he'd be a really great fit for Renault, assuming that Renault remains in the sport and assuming that Renault remains sort of at the top to middle of the midfield. Danny Kvyat actually has a lot in common with Gasly, and by a lot, I mean just this one thing, which is that he was demoted from the Red Bull team, the main Red Bull team, mid-season. This occurred back in 2015, though. Kvyat's been around for a little while. He is definitely a veteran on the paddock. He's quite capable. He has also spent some time out of Formula One. He missed the 2018 season, but came back in 2019 and proved himself to be a much more mature and capable sort of driver. When they were looking for a replacement for Gasly up at the top team, their 2 main options were basically Albon or Kvyat. And I was actually, honestly, a little bit surprised that they didn't give Kvyat another shot up there. I guess I should rephrase that, because I wasn't so surprised from like a petty drama sort of perspective. The management at Red Bull definitely has this vibe about them, whether it's rightful or not, of carrying grudges, more or less. And since Kvyat already had a shot at the top team, I guess I shouldn't have been surprised that he didn't get another one. That being said, though, I think he's a very accomplished driver. He's well worth a seat in the F1 paddock somewhere. For both of these drivers, for both Gasly and Kvyat, I would be a little bit surprised if both of them return to AlphaTauri next year. I see Gasly going to Renault, and I see Kvyat going to, if they're still around, Haas. I could also see Kvyat filling roles at basically any one of the other midfield teams. He's quite capable, and he delivers solid performances. And I apologize right now if it feels like I'm kind of blasting through these, but we do have 4 teams to get through in this one episode, and we're going to move on now to the 4th and final one, which is Racing Point. Now, I can and probably should and probably will do a podcast episode dedicated to sort of the recent history of Racing Point and where they're going in the future. The gist of it, though, is that Racing Point as it exists now first entered the sport as Force India. There were some financial troubles for the team owner of Force India, and the team was placed into administration, which in the UK, if you're not familiar, is sort of a managed form of bankruptcy. It was then sold to Lawrence Stroll, a Canadian billionaire who was heavily involved in supporting his son Lance Stroll's efforts in Formula One. Unsurprisingly, last year, Lance Stroll joined the team as it was rebranded to Racing Point. And just recently, relatively recent developments, Lawrence Stroll has purchased essentially Aston Martin and will be rebranding Racing Point into Aston Martin beginning next year. So in the span of 4 years, this team will have had 3 different names. Their team principal, though, is a guy by the name of Otmar Safnauer. He's actually an American. He's the only American team principal out there. He seems like a great guy, and I don't say that just because he's American. He's very sharp. He gives really great interviews, and if you get a chance, you should definitely listen to him. Their driver lineup is unchanged from last year, and that consists of Sergio Perez, who is a Mexican driver who early in his career was labeled as a bit of a pay driver, even though he himself comes from humble origins and seems like a very genuine, humble guy. He is backed extensively by Mexican billionaire Carlos Slim from a very early age. He's pretty underrated, I think, still on the grid. Not a lot of people give him a whole lot of credit. He could have easily ended up at a team like Ferrari, but just kind of didn't work out that way. He signed on a really long-term deal with Racing Point and soon to be Aston Martin, and should be on the grid for a good long time, which I think is a great thing. He's a great driver and fully deserves a seat. Finally, we get to the last driver in this episode, which is Lance Stroll. As already mentioned, he is definitely a pay driver. His dad first brought major money to Williams, which we'll talk about in the third and final episode of the series, in order to secure him a seat there. And when the opportunity became available, obviously he bought for Force India. He bought an entire Formula One team and then gave his son a seat, which, dad of the year, certainly. However, I think one of the things that gets lost in all of this, because it is just such a blatant use of money to secure a seat, is, well, there's a couple things, and I'll talk about this at length probably in some other episode, but this is sort of the case with every seat in Formula One. Every seat in Formula One comes with the expectation that the driver is bringing money, whether that money comes from their dad or whether that money comes from an array of sponsors. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day. They still got to bring some money in. And the other thing that gets overlooked when it comes to Lance Stroll is the fact that he's pretty good. In junior formulas, he performed really well. He absolutely destroyed all of the competition in Formula 3 in 2016 before joining Williams in 2017. So I think that he didn't have the Formula 2 career that I think makes us all think much more highly of people like George Russell or Lando Norris or Alexander Albon or Charles Leclerc even. But, he's been racing in Formula One from a very early age. He's one of the youngest drivers on the grid still. And I think he can definitely hold his own at times. He was able to secure a podium at a very crazy race in Baku when he raced with Williams. And I think that speaks volumes, honestly. It's a freakish race, but you got to be in it to win it kind of thing. And he was definitely in it. So I'm curious to see how he holds up over time against Sergio Perez. I think that he's actually an outside shot to get a seat at an even better team, if we're perfectly honest. A lot of money comes with him, but also there's a lot of talent there. And I would not be shocked if I saw him in a Mercedes uniform at some point in his career. Now, does he rate highly or more highly than the likes of Esteban Ocon or George Russell when it comes to Mercedes? Definitely not. He's definitely going to be really far down the list. I could see Sebastian Vettel or Daniel Ricciardo or, any number of people getting a drive at Mercedes before Stroll. But I would not be surprised if Stroll did end up driving there at some point in his career. And his career should probably be a long one. Anybody that has this level of talent and this amazing level of funding is going to be in the sport for a really long time. And that about wraps it up. That's episode 2 of 3 done. We are now 7 teams out of 10 complete for the grid. Please come back next time on episode 3 and we will cover the last 3 teams to drive in Formula One in 2020. If you like the show, subscribe, share it with a friend. If you don't like it, give me some feedback. Tell me why that is. You can go to theopenwheelshow.com or theopenwheel.show if you're a more advanced internet user, and I say that completely facetiously. I'd love to hear from you, any feedback that you have, and we'll see you on the next time.